The mess hall buzzed with the usual dinner chatter as Sarah Martinez quietly made her way through the food line. She had just transferred to Naval Base San Diego 3 days ago, and everything still felt unfamiliar. The fluorescent lights cast harsh shadows across the long tables where sailors gathered in their familiar groups, sharing stories and complaints about their day. Sarah chose a small table near the corner, hoping to eat in peace. She had learned long ago that drawing attention to herself rarely led to anything good, especially in new environments. Her petite frame and quiet demeanor often led people to make assumptions about her capabilities, assumptions she had grown tired of correcting. As she sat down with her tray of meatloaf and mashed potatoes, she noticed a group of 11 young sailors approaching her table. They moved with the swagger that came with recent graduation from boot camp, their uniforms still crisp and their confidence still untested by real experience. The leader of the group, a tall blonde named Jake Morrison, slammed his tray down across from Sarah with unnecessary force. His friends quickly surrounded the table, creating a wall of bodies that blocked her from the rest of the mess hall. Sarah continued eating, keeping her eyes on her food while mentally assessing the situation. Well, what do we have here?" Jake said loudly, his voice carrying across the nearby tables. "Looks like we got ourselves a lost little sailor girl. You sure you're in the right place, sweetheart?" His friends laughed on cue, their voices mixing into an ugly chorus of mockery. Sarah took another bite of her meatloaf, chewing slowly while she watched Jake through her peripheral vision. She had dealt with bullies before, in high school and college, and unfortunately, even in some of her previous military assignments. "I'm talking to you," Jake continued, leaning forward across the table. "Don't you know it's rude to ignore someone when they're being friendly?" One of his companions, a stocky redhead named Tommy, chimed in. "Maybe she's scared, Jake. Look at her shaking." This wasn't true, but it got another round of laughter from the group. Sarah finally looked up, meeting Jake's eyes with a calm, steady gaze. "I'm just trying to eat my dinner," she said quietly. "Is there something you need?" The simplicity of her response seemed to catch Jake off guard for a moment, but he quickly recovered. "What I need," he said, his voice getting louder, "is for little girls to stay out of places where real sailors eat. This isn't a daycare center." The comment drew attention from other tables, and Sarah could feel eyes turning toward their corner. Some sailors looked uncomfortable with what they were witnessing, but none moved to intervene. This was military culture at its worst, where standing up to a group could make you their next target. Sarah set down her fork and folded her hands on the table. Her movements were deliberate and controlled, lacking any hint of nervousness or fear. "I have as much right to be here as anyone else," she said, her voice still quiet but carrying a note of steel that made several of the bullies exchange uncertain glances. Jake wasn't ready to back down. He had an audience now and his reputation was on the line. "Rights?" He laughed. "What rights? You probably can't even do 10 push-ups. I bet you cried during your first PT test." His friends erupted in laughter again, but Sarah noticed that some of them looked less enthusiastic now. A few were shifting uncomfortably, perhaps sensing that something about this situation wasn't quite what it seemed. "Tell you what," Jake continued, emboldened by his friends' laughter. "Why don't you show us what you've got? Drop down right here and give us 20 push-ups. If you can manage that without crying, maybe we'll let you finish your dinner." The mess hall had grown noticeably quieter as more people became aware of the confrontation. Sarah could feel the weight of dozens of eyes on her, waiting to see how she would respond. Some faces showed sympathy, others curiosity, and a few displayed the kind of cruel anticipation that feeds on others' humiliation. Sarah stood up slowly, her chair scraping against the floor in the sudden silence. The 11 sailors around her tensed slightly, perhaps expecting her to flee or break down in tears. Instead, she calmly pushed her chair back and looked around at each of their faces, memorizing details with the practiced eye of someone trained to observe and remember. 20 push-ups?" she asked, her voice carrying clearly in the quiet mess hall. Jake grinned triumphantly, thinking he had won. "That's right, sweetheart. 20 perfect push-ups or you find somewhere else to eat." What happened next would become the stuff of base legend, retold in whispered conversations and embellished with each telling. But those who were there that night would always remember the moment when everything changed, when assumptions crumbled and reputations were rebuilt in the span of a heartbeat. Sarah looked down at the mess hall floor, then back at Jake. "Just 20? she asked, and something in her tone made the smirk on his face waver slightly. Without another word, she dropped to the floor. But instead of the awkward, struggling form Jake expected to see, Sarah's body moved with the fluid precision of someone who had performed this exercise thousands of times. Her form was perfect, her back straight as a board, her movements controlled and rhythmic. She knocked out 20 push-ups in less than 30 seconds, each repetition executed with textbook precision. The mess hall was dead silent except for the sound of her breathing and the soft contact of her palms against the floor. When she finished, she rose smoothly to her feet, not even slightly winded. "That's 20, she said simply, dusting off her hands. Jake's face had gone pale, but he wasn't ready to admit defeat. "Lucky warm-up," he muttered, though his voice lacked its earlier confidence. "Anyone can do 20. How about 50? Several of his friends shot him warning glances. But Jake was too committed to back down now. He had started this confrontation in front of the entire mess hall, and his pride wouldn't let him walk away. Sarah tilted her head slightly, studying him with an expression that was becoming increasingly unsettling. 50, she repeated. "And then?" "And then maybe you prove you belong here," Jake said. But even he seemed to realize how weak that sounded. Without hesitation, Sarah dropped back down. This time her performance was even more impressive. She moved through the push-ups like a machine, her count steady and unwavering. Her breathing remained controlled and her form never wavered even as she passed 30, then 40, then 50. When she stood up this time, there was a slight sheen of sweat on her forehead, but she still looked like she could continue indefinitely. The silence in the mess hall was now absolute, broken only by the distant sound of kitchen work from behind the serving line. Jake was staring at her with a mixture of confusion and growing alarm. This wasn't how this was supposed to go. The petite woman in front of him had just performed better than most of his friends could manage, and she had done it without breaking a sweat or showing any signs of strain. "How about we make this interesting?" Sarah said, her voice cutting through the silence like a blade. There was something different about her now, a subtle shift in posture and demeanor that made several of the sailors take an unconscious step backward. She walked over to Jake, moving with a controlled grace that reminded some of the older sailors of predators they had seen in nature documentaries. "You want to know if I belong here? Fine, let's find out if you do." Jake tried to maintain his bravado, but uncertainty flickered in his eyes. "What's that supposed to mean?" "I'll arm wrestle all 11 of you," Sarah said clearly, her voice carrying to every corner of the mess hall. "One by one. If I lose even once, I'll transfer to a different base. If I win all 11 matches, you and your friends here will spend the next month scrubbing every toilet on this base with toothbrushes." The mess hall erupted in whispers and murmurs. This was unprecedented. A tiny woman challenging 11 sailors to physical contests was either insane or incredibly confident. Most of the spectators were beginning to suspect it wasn't insanity. Jake looked around at his friends, seeing his own uncertainty reflected in their faces. They had come here expecting to humiliate an easy target, but something had gone very wrong. The woman standing in front of them didn't look like a victim anymore. She looked like something much more dangerous. "You're crazy," he said, but his voice cracked slightly on the words. Sarah smiled for the first time since the confrontation began, and it wasn't a pleasant expression. "Maybe, but I'm also right here and you started this. So what's it going to be? Are you going to back up all that tough talk, or are you going to slink away with your tail between your legs?" The challenge hung in the air like a physical presence. Jake could feel the eyes of the entire mess hall on him, waiting to see what he would do. His friends were looking at him expectantly, but he could see doubt creeping into their expressions. He was trapped by his own bravado, caught between the humiliation of backing down and the growing certainty that accepting this challenge would lead to something much worse. But with hundreds of sailors watching, there was really only one choice he could make. "Fine," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "You want to embarrass yourself, go ahead." Sarah's smile widened, and for the first time some of the spectators began to suspect that Jake Morrison and his friends had just made a terrible mistake. Someone quickly cleared a table and brought over 2 chairs. Word of the challenge had spread beyond the mess hall, and sailors were filtering in from other parts of the base. The crowd now numbered in the hundreds, forming a tight circle around the makeshift arena. Jake sat down first, rolling up his sleeves with exaggerated confidence. He was a big man, standing 6 feet 2 inches and weighing at least 200 pounds. His arms were thick from months of regular PT and weight training. Across from him, Sarah looked almost childlike by comparison. She sat down calmly, placing her elbow on the table with practiced ease. Her arm looked impossibly small next to Jake's, and several people in the crowd shook their heads in disbelief. This wasn't going to be a contest, it was going to be a massacre. An older petty officer stepped forward to referee, his face grave with concern. "You sure about this, sailor?" he asked Sarah quietly. No shame in walking away from something like this. Sarah looked up at him with those steady eyes that were beginning to unnerve everyone who met them. "I'm sure," she said simply. The referee positioned their hands, checking their grips and alignment. "This is a standard arm wrestling match," he announced to the crowd. "Best grip wins, no lifting your elbow, no using your other hand. Ready?" Jake flexed his arm, feeling confident despite his earlier doubts. He outweighed this woman by at least 70 pounds, and his reach advantage was significant. "There was no way this could go wrong. Go!" the referee shouted. Jake immediately applied pressure, expecting to slam Sarah's hand down within seconds. Instead, her arm didn't budge. Not even slightly. It felt like he was trying to move a steel beam anchored in concrete. Confusion flashed across his face as he applied more force. Still nothing. Sarah's arm remained perfectly vertical, showing no signs of strain or effort. She wasn't even looking at their joined hands, instead gazing calmly around at the crowd with what appeared to be mild interest. The crowd was murmuring now, sensing that something unexpected was happening. Jake's face began to redden as he put everything he had into the contest, the veins in his neck standing out with effort. Sweat beaded on his forehead as he strained against an immovable force. Sarah turned her attention back to him, and Jake felt a chill run down his spine. There was something in her eyes now. Something cold and professional that made him think of documentaries he had seen about sharks. "You done?" she asked conversationally. Before Jake could respond, Sarah's arm began to move. Not quickly, not with obvious effort, but with the inexorable force of a hydraulic press. Jake's arm, despite all his straining and effort, began to descend toward the table. He tried everything, leaning his entire body weight into the contest, gritting his teeth and pouring every ounce of strength he possessed into his arm. It made no difference. Sarah's arm continued its steady downward pressure until Jake's hand touched the table with a soft thud. The mess hall erupted in shocked voices and scattered applause. Jake sat there staring at his defeated hand, unable to process what had just happened. He had been completely overpowered by someone who appeared to be exerting no effort whatsoever. "Next," Sarah said simply. Tommy, the stocky redhead, stepped forward with considerably less confidence than his friend had shown. He had just watched Jake, their strongest member, get demolished without Sarah even breaking a sweat. But backing down now would mean admitting they had all made a serious mistake. The second match lasted even less time than the first. Tommy's hand hit the table within 10 seconds, and he immediately began massaging his wrist, wincing at the soreness that radiated up his arm. The third sailor, then the fourth, then the fifth. Each match followed the same pattern. Sarah would sit calmly, grip their hand, and then methodically overpower them with what appeared to be casual effort. By the sixth match, several of Jake's friends were looking genuinely scared. The crowd had grown quiet again, but it was a different kind of silence now. This wasn't the uncomfortable quiet of witnessing bullying. It was the hushed awe of people watching something extraordinary. Whispered conversations rippled through the gathering as sailors tried to make sense of what they were seeing. "Who is she?" someone asked. "Never seen anything like it," another voice replied. "That's not normal strength. That's something else entirely." As the seventh sailor sat down across from Sarah, his hand visibly shaking, more people began to arrive. Word was spreading throughout the base that something incredible was happening in the mess hall. Senior officers began filtering into the crowd, their expressions growing increasingly curious as they observed the scene. The seventh match ended even more quickly than the others. The sailor's hand barely touched Sarah's before it was pressed firmly against the table. He stood up immediately, cradling his arm and looking at Sarah with something approaching fear. 3 matches left, and Jake's remaining friends were beginning to understand that they weren't just going to lose this bet. They were about to be humiliated in front of what now appeared to be half the base. But more than that, they were starting to realize that they had seriously misjudged who they were dealing with. Sarah sat patiently, waiting for the 8th challenger, her breathing still steady and her demeanor unchanged. If anything, she looked slightly bored, like this entire spectacle was nothing more than a minor inconvenience in her evening. The eighth sailor approached the table with obvious reluctance. His name was Marcus, and he had been having second thoughts about this whole situation since Sarah's third victory. Up close, he could see details that the crowd couldn't. Her hands showed calluses and specific patterns that spoke of extensive weapons training. Her posture was too perfect, too controlled, like someone who had undergone years of specialized conditioning. "Listen," he said quietly as he sat down. "Maybe we can just call this off. We get the point." Sarah studied him for a moment, and Marcus thought he saw a flicker of something that might have been approval in her eyes. "Afraid not," she said, not unkindly. "Your friend Jake made the terms pretty clear. All 11 or you're scrubbing toilets for a month." The match was over in seconds. Marcus offered token resistance, but his heart wasn't in it. When his hand touched the table, he actually looked relieved. As he walked away, massaging his wrist, Marcus caught sight of someone in the crowd that made his blood run cold. Master Chief Petty Officer Rodriguez, one of the most respected senior enlisted men on the base, was standing near the back of the gathering. His face was unreadable, but his presence meant that this situation had attracted official attention. The 9th and 10th matches proceeded with the same inevitable results. By now, the remaining sailors were just going through the motions, hoping to get this nightmare over with as quickly as possible. The crowd had swollen to enormous proportions, with people packed shoulder to shoulder around the table. Jake watched his final friend's hand get pressed to the table and felt his stomach drop. He was the last one. He had started this confrontation with swagger and confidence, and now he was about to face public humiliation in front of what appeared to be half the Pacific Fleet. As he approached the table for the second time, Sarah looked up at him with an expression that was almost pitying. "Last chance to apologize and walk away," she said quietly, her voice pitched so only he could hear. Jake's pride flared one final time. "Just get this over with," he muttered. He sat down and gripped her hand, trying to prepare himself mentally for what was coming. But this time, Sarah didn't start immediately. Instead, she leaned forward slightly and spoke in a voice that carried clearly to every corner of the mess hall. "Before we finish this," she said, "I want everyone here to understand something. This isn't about me proving how strong I am. This is about respect. This is about treating people with dignity, regardless of how they look or what assumptions you make about them." She paused, looking around at the crowd. "Every single person in this room has value. Every one of you has skills and experiences that deserve recognition. When you decide to bully someone because they don't fit your idea of what a sailor should look like, you're not just hurting them. You're damaging the integrity of our entire service." The silence was absolute now. Even the kitchen staff had stopped their work to listen. "Now," Sarah continued, turning her attention back to Jake, "let's finish what you started." The final match was different from the others. Instead of the quick, decisive victory everyone expected, Sarah let Jake struggle. She allowed him to think he had a chance, let him pour every ounce of strength he possessed into the contest. For nearly a minute, their hands remained locked, in the center of the table while Jake strained with everything he had. Then slowly and deliberately, Sarah began to apply pressure. Jake's arms started to descend, fighting every inch of the way. The crowd could see the exact moment when Jake realized that Sarah had been toying with him, that she could have ended this at any time but had chosen to let him exhaust himself first. When his hand finally touched the table, Jake slumped in his chair, defeated in every possible way. The crowd remained silent, processing what they had just witnessed. Sarah stood up and walked around the table to where Jake sat. For a moment, everyone thought she might add insult to injury with some final cutting remark. Instead, she extended her hand. "No hard feelings," she said simply. "But you and your friends have some toilet scrubbing to do." Jake looked up at her, seeing her clearly for the first time. The woman standing in front of him wasn't just strong, she was something else entirely. Something that made his earlier behavior seem not just wrong but foolishly dangerous. He shook her hand, wincing slightly at her grip. "Who are you?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper. Sarah smiled. But before she could answer, a voice cut through the crowd from the back of the mess hall. "Attention!" Master Chief Rodriguez's voice boomed across the room, and every sailor immediately snapped to attention. He walked through the crowd, which parted before him like water. When he reached the table, he looked at Sarah with an expression that was impossible to read. The tension in the room was palpable as everyone waited to see how the senior enlisted man would react to this unprecedented situation. "Martinez," he said finally, and Sarah straightened slightly at the sound of her name. "I think it's time these sailors knew exactly who they just messed with." Master Chief Rodriguez stood at attention and saluted Sarah, his movements crisp and respectful. The entire mess hall watched in stunned silence as she returned the salute with the same precision. "Ladies and gentlemen," Rodriguez announced, his voice carrying to every corner of the room, "allow me to introduce Petty Officer First Class Sarah Martinez, United States Navy SEALs." The words hit the crowd like a physical blow. Gasps and whispers rippled through the gathering as the full implications sank in. Jake and his friends looked like they wanted to disappear through the floor. They had just tried to bully one of the most elite warriors in the entire military. "Petty Officer Martinez," Rodriguez continued, "recently completed a deployment in Afghanistan, where she participated in 17 classified operations. She holds commendations for valor, expert marksmanship, and advanced combat diving. She speaks 4 languages fluently and holds a degree in engineering from the Naval Academy." Each detail hit Jake like a hammer blow. This wasn't just embarrassing anymore, it was terrifying. Navy SEALs were legendary figures, the kind of warriors that regular sailors read about in books and saw in movies. He had tried to intimidate someone who could probably kill him with her bare hands. Sarah stepped forward slightly and her voice carried clearly across the silent mess hall. "I didn't want this to become about my service record," she said. "I was hoping we could resolve this like adults without rank or specialization entering into it. But since we're here, let me be clear about something." She turned to address not just Jake and his friends, but the entire crowd. "Being a SEAL doesn't make me better than anyone else in this room. It means I've received specialized training for specific missions. Every rate in the Navy matters. Every job is important. The cook who prepared this meal is just as valuable to our mission as I am." Her words carried a weight that went beyond her military achievements. Here was someone who had reached the pinnacle of military service, and she was using that platform to emphasize unity rather than superiority. "However," she continued, her tone becoming harder, "there's something else you should know. SEALs are trained to assess threats quickly and respond appropriately. When someone approaches me in a threatening manner, especially when they try to isolate me from potential help, my training kicks in automatically." Jake felt his blood turn to ice as he realized what she was saying. From the moment he and his friends had surrounded her table, Sarah had been evaluating them as potential threats. She had been ready to respond with force if necessary. And that response would have been swift and devastating. "You're lucky," she said, looking directly at Jake, "that I recognized you were just bullies instead of actual threats. Because the techniques I'm trained to use aren't designed to be non-lethal." The silence in the mess hall was deafening. Several of the younger sailors looked genuinely scared as they contemplated how differently this evening could have ended. Master Chief Rodriguez stepped forward again. "I think this has been educational for everyone involved," he said. "Morrison, you and your friends report to me tomorrow at 0600. We'll discuss your new cleaning assignments then." Jake nodded weakly, unable to find his voice. The thought of spending a month scrubbing toilets seemed like the least of his problems now. "As for the rest of you," Rodriguez continued, addressing the crowd, "I hope you've learned something tonight about making assumptions and treating your fellow sailors with respect. Petty Officer Martinez could have handled this situation very differently, and we should all be grateful she chose the path she did." Sarah picked up her tray, which had somehow survived the entire confrontation. Her dinner was cold now, but she began eating anyway, as if nothing unusual had happened. The crowd began to disperse slowly, people leaving in small groups while casting odd glances back at the small woman who had just redefined their understanding of strength and capability. Jake and his friends lingered near the table, uncertain whether they should leave or try to apologize further. Sarah noticed their hesitation and looked up from her meal. "You can go," she said simply. "Just remember this feeling the next time you think about picking on someone who looks like an easy target." As they filed out of the mess hall, Jake heard fragments of conversation from the departing crowd. The story was already evolving, taking on the mythical quality that military legends acquire. By morning, the tale would be all over the base, and by the end of the week, it would have spread to every naval installation on the West Coast. But for now, Sarah Martinez sat alone at her corner table, finishing her cold dinner in peace. The mess hall gradually returned to normal, though she noticed that other sailors were giving her a much wider berth than before. Some looked at her with newfound respect, others with wariness, and a few with the kind of hero worship that made her uncomfortable. She had accomplished what she set out to do. The bullying would stop, not just for her but for others who might have been targeted in the future. But she also knew that her quiet days on this base were over. Word of tonight's events would reach the officers, and questions would be asked about why a Navy SEAL was eating in the regular mess hall instead of the Special Operations facility. As she finished her meal and prepared to leave, Sarah reflected on the irony of the situation. She had spent years training to be invisible, to blend in and avoid detection. But sometimes the best way to disappear was to make sure everyone remembered exactly why they should leave you alone. 3 days after the mess hall incident, Sarah was summoned to the base commander's office. Captain Rebecca Walsh was a decorated officer with 25 years of service, and her reputation for fairness was matched only by her intolerance for disruption. Sarah knocked on the office door and entered when called. Captain Walsh was seated behind her desk, reviewing what appeared to be incident reports. She looked up as Sarah approached and gestured to a chair. "Sit down, Petty Officer Martinez," Walsh said, her voice neutral. "We need to discuss what happened in the mess hall." Sarah remained at attention. "Request permission to remain standing, ma'am." "Granted." Walsh leaned back in her chair, studying Sarah with sharp eyes. "I've read Master Chief Rodriguez's report and I've spoken with several witnesses. I've also received no fewer than 12 formal complaints about your conduct." Sarah's expression didn't change, but internally, she prepared for disciplinary action. Bringing attention to her special operations background was exactly what she had hoped to avoid. "However," Walsh continued, "I've also received 47 written statements commending your professionalism and restraint. Apparently, quite a few sailors feel you handled a difficult situation with remarkable composure." She picked up a folder from her desk and opened it. "Your service record makes for interesting reading. 3 combat deployments, specialized training certifications I can't even pronounce, and commendations from officers who describe you as one of the finest sailors they've ever commanded." Sarah remained silent, waiting for the captain to get to the point. "What I want to know," Walsh said, leaning forward, "is why a Navy SEAL is hiding in my regular enlisted quarters instead of being housed with the Special Operations Unit where she belongs." This was the question Sarah had been dreading. "Ma'am, I requested standard billeting to maintain operational security. My current assignment doesn't require special operations facilities." "Your current assignment," Walsh said, consulting another document, "appears to be classified well above my clearance level, which raises some interesting questions about why you're on my base at all." Before Sarah could respond, Walsh's phone rang. The captain answered it, listened for a moment, then looked surprised. "Send him in immediately," she said. The door opened and a man in civilian clothes entered. He was average height with graying hair and the kind of unremarkable appearance that suggested he was very good at blending into crowds. Sarah recognized the type immediately, though she gave no outward sign. "Captain Walsh," the man said, producing credentials. "Special Agent David Chen, Naval Intelligence. I need to speak with Petty Officer Martinez." Walsh examined his identification carefully, then nodded. "Of course. Should I step out?" "That won't be necessary, ma'am. In fact, your presence might be helpful." Chen turned to Sarah. "Petty Officer, your cover has been compromised. The incident 3 days ago has attracted exactly the kind of attention we were hoping to avoid." Sarah's heart sank, though her expression remained neutral. "How compromised, sir?" "Videos of your performance have been circulating on social media. Someone recorded the arm wrestling matches on their phone, and it's gone viral. We've had inquiries from news outlets, military bloggers, and at least 3 foreign intelligence services." Captain Walsh looked between them, confusion evident on her face. "I'm afraid I don't understand what's happening here." Chen glanced at Sarah, who nodded slightly. "Captain, Petty Officer Martinez isn't just any Navy SEAL. She's part of a highly classified program that we can't discuss in detail. Her presence on this base was meant to be temporary and unnoticed. Well, that plan has clearly failed. Walsh said dryly. Indeed it has. Chen pulled out a tablet and showed them a video. Sarah watched herself arm wrestling Jake Morrison, the footage clear and damning. The view count was already in the hundreds of thousands. The comments are particularly interesting, Chen continued, scrolling through them. People are calling you everything from a superhero to a government experiment. There's a conspiracy theory thread that already has 10,000 responses. Sarah closed her eyes briefly. This was a nightmare scenario for someone in her line of work. Anonymity was essential for special operations personnel, and she had just become an internet sensation. What are my orders, sir? She asked. That's still being determined at levels above my pay grade, Chen replied. For now, you're to maintain your current cover story. No interviews, no social media presence, no acknowledgement of the video's existence, Captain Walsh interjected. With respect, Agent Chen, I have a base full of sailors who now know I'm housing someone with extraordinary capabilities. This is going to affect morale, operations, and security protocols. You're absolutely right, Chen agreed, which is why we're implementing immediate changes. Petty Officer Martinez will be transferring to a classified facility within 48 hours. Sarah felt a mixture of relief and disappointment. Relief that her compromised situation would be resolved. Disappointment that her hope for a normal assignment was over before it had really begun. In the meantime, Chen continued, we need to manage the fallout. Captain, I'll need you to issue a statement that the video shows a routine training exercise that was misrepresented online. No mention of special operations or classified programs. Walsh nodded. Understood. What about the sailors involved in the original incident? They'll be transferred to different bases over the next few weeks. Nothing punitive, just routine reassignments that will prevent them from becoming focal points for media attention. Sarah thought about Jake Morrison and his friends. They had learned a valuable lesson about respect and assumptions, but now they were facing consequences they never could have imagined when they sat down at her table 3 days ago. Sir, Sarah said, request permission to speak to the involved sailors before they transfer. I'd like to make sure they understand this isn't their fault. Chen considered this. That's probably wise. Their cooperation in maintaining operational security will be essential. As the meeting continued, Sarah reflected on how quickly her carefully planned anonymity had crumbled. One moment of standing up for herself had cascaded into an international incident that would reshape her entire career. But looking back, she knew she would make the same choice again. Some principles were worth the consequences. On her final evening at Naval Base San Diego, Sarah found Jake Morrison sitting alone outside the barracks, staring out at the ocean. The past few days had clearly taken their toll on him. His usual swagger was gone, replaced by a thoughtful quietness that made him seem much younger than his 22 years. Mind if I sit? Sarah asked. Jake looked up, startled. Oh, hey, yeah, sure. He moved over on the bench, making room for her. They sat in comfortable silence for a few minutes, watching the sunset paint the Pacific in shades of orange and gold. Finally, Jake spoke. I keep thinking about that night, he said quietly. About how different it could have gone if you'd wanted to really hurt us. Sarah nodded. The thought occurred to me, but that's not who I am, and more importantly, that's not who any of us should be. Agent Chen said we're all getting transferred. Different bases, clean slates. Jake glanced at her. He also said not to talk about what happened, ever. That's probably for the best, for everyone involved. Jake was quiet for another moment, then asked, Can I ask you something? Why didn't you just tell us who you were from the beginning? Would have saved everyone a lot of trouble. Sarah considered the question carefully. Because being a SEAL doesn't make me special. It's just a job like any other rate in the Navy. The moment I start using my training as a shield or a weapon in everyday situations, I've lost something important. But you are special, Jake insisted. I mean, what you did that night, what you're capable of, that's not normal. No, Sarah agreed. It's not normal. But it's also not the most important thing about me. I'm a sailor first, just like you. I signed up to serve my country, to be part of something bigger than myself. The specialized training came later. Jake shook his head. I feel like such an idiot. We came at you like you were some kind of target, and you could have destroyed all of us without breaking a sweat. You made a mistake, Sarah said simply. A bad one, but a mistake nonetheless. The important thing is what you do with that experience. I've been thinking about that a lot, Jake admitted. About how many times I've probably done the same thing to other people who couldn't fight back. Makes me sick, honestly. Sarah turned to look at him directly. That feeling you have right now? That's your conscience working. Don't ignore it. Let it guide you going forward. My new assignment is in Norfolk, Jake said. Tommy's going to Great Lakes, Marcus to Pearl Harbor. We'll probably never see each other again. Maybe that's for the best. Fresh starts all around. They sat quietly again, both lost in their own thoughts. Eventually, Jake spoke again. The other guys, they're all scared about the transfers. Worried about starting over, about people finding out what happened. But honestly, I'm kind of relieved. Gives me a chance to be better than I was here. Sarah smiled. That's probably the smartest thing I've heard you say. Thanks, Jake said, then laughed slightly. I think that's the first time you've complimented me. Don't let it go to your head. As the last light faded from the sky, Jake stood up. I should probably get back. Early flight tomorrow. He paused, looking down at her. For what it's worth, I'm sorry. Not just about the mess hall, but about everything. The way we acted, the assumptions we made, you deserved better from all of us. Sarah stood as well and extended her hand. Apology accepted. Good luck in Norfolk, Jake. Make the most of your second chance. They shook hands, and Jake was surprised to realize he felt no fear this time, only respect. What about you? Where are you headed? Classified, Sarah said with a slight smile. But wherever it is, I'll make the most of it too. After Jake left, Sarah remained outside for another hour, watching the stars emerge in the darkening sky. Tomorrow she would report to a new assignment, one that would undoubtedly be challenging in ways she couldn't yet imagine. Her cover was blown, her anonymity lost, but somehow she felt optimistic about the future. The viral video had been taken, down after 48 hours, but not before it had been downloaded and shared countless times. She would never again be able to blend into a crowd the way she once had. That chapter of her career was over, but perhaps that wasn't entirely a bad thing. The incident in the mess hall had shown her something important about leadership and standing up for what was right. She had spent so much time learning to be invisible that she had almost forgotten the value of being seen when it mattered. 3 months later, at a classified facility on the East Coast, Sarah would find herself training a new class of special operations candidates. Her first lesson would be about the difference between strength and power, between capability and character. She would tell them that the most important battles they would ever fight wouldn't be against foreign enemies or terrorist threats, but against the parts of themselves that wanted to use their abilities for the wrong reasons. Some of her students would understand immediately. Others would need to learn the hard way, just as Jake Morrison had learned in a mess hall in San Diego. But they would all eventually understand that true strength wasn't about how much weight you could lift or how many push-ups you could do. It was about choosing to do the right thing, even when you had the power to do otherwise, especially then.